General Pavel Macko's Security Radar. Episode 124.
Russians are mass murdering Ukrainian civilians and threatening to occupy Paris. Ukraine is resisting, but losses are increasing. There is still no peace in the Middle East, and Israel is under international pressure. Cambodia and Thailand have agreed to a ceasefire. Welcome, dear listeners, to the 124th episode of Security Radar with General Pavel Macko. Good morning, Pavel.
Good morning to you too. Good morning, thank you.
Part 1, Fog of War.
Before we move on to the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine, please comment, if you can, on yesterday's attack on Kyiv. What are the Russians trying to achieve there?
I'll start with what actually happened. The Russians launched 309 drones. Not all of them went to Kyiv, but a large portion that did go to Kyiv attacked from all directions. Immediately in the next wave, they launched 8 Iskander-K cruise missiles. We mostly know the Iskander-M ballistic missiles. These are standard ballistic missiles. One is on that launcher and it weighs 3,800 kilograms and has warheads from about 380 kilograms to 700 kilograms depending on the type. And these K versions, that's actually K for Krylataya, which is the winged version. It's slightly smaller than the Iskander-M, but it has a range of over 500 kilometers. That's why it was controversial for the USA when they withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Over 500 kilometers is already a short and medium-range missile that was covered by this treaty. The Russians were violating that treaty. It has the designation 9M728, from which the caliber missile 9M729 is also derived, which is launched from naval platforms and has a longer range. This missile has roughly a 500 kilogram warhead. When we look at it, they actually directed them into the city, right into the center of the inhabited zone. When we saw that 9-story building, not only that building itself but also the surroundings, everything was just apartment blocks, civilian buildings, a kindergarten, a health center. This means it's impossible that the Russians made some miscalculation, a mistake, or that they would pretend, as in the case of Sumy, that there must have been some soldiers there. They simply wanted to destroy that apartment building. They wanted to create this shock wave. Because that missile, for those who don't know, if we're talking about the Iskander-K, has a circular accuracy of 5 meters. That means it doesn't deviate more than 5 meters from the assigned target coordinates. So that apartment building was assigned as a target, that's highly probable. I can't imagine under what circumstances they would make a mistake. If it fell into some district where there's a factory, and it flies a few dozen meters off and hits something else, I understand that. The effect is enormous, devastating. In short, these are missiles that have a warhead similar to the Storm Shadow, which is meant to penetrate even hardened objects. That means some brigade command post should be able to be seriously damaged or destroyed by it. So we saw a massive devastating effect. We've explained these drone attacks several times. These drones attack simultaneously from different directions. The Ukrainians are no longer using missiles against these drones, because they simply don't have enough missiles, and not even for these cruise missiles, because it's not that simple. The Russians use this Iskander-K because most cruise missiles, even the large ones from the X category, are subsonic. This Iskander-K missile flies at a speed of about Mach 6, that means it's a hypersonic missile. Although it's not a hypersonic missile by definition, because we talk about hypersonic gliders at over Mach 10, but everything that's over Mach 5, and that's every ballistic missile, has hypersonic speed, which is the threshold of those Mach 5 times the speed of sound. So the Iskander-K cruise missile is very fast. And now 25 dead, according to the latest reports already 26, it's increasing, unfortunately, and about 150 injured. So directly to your question about what the Russians are trying to achieve, in the long term, they don't have it directly written in their doctrine that they should destroy such civilian targets. They have in their military doctrine and in their military practice that they destroy civilian objects as well. They destroy roads, infrastructure, railways, substations, heating plants or power plants, transformer stations. And the purpose of this is, first, to paralyze the course of normal life, second, psychological warfare, simply to terrorize the population. And there are expectations of smaller losses, and at the same time it's a tool of political pressure on the opponent. And they use this systematically. So when they used it now, they're escalating the pressure again, and Trump's ultimatum is still running. And the Russians are making it clear that, you know what, it could be worse, we could also use weapons of mass destruction. And I'm connecting this with the fact that they actually want to intimidate. They know it doesn't work, yet they have nothing else, because they're not such champions on the battlefield. So they simply want to intimidate Ukrainians at all costs. And that's exactly what they're telling us again this week on Russian state television. We need to intimidate all of Europe, we need to occupy Paris, we need to rename it Vladimir Insane, they're threatening Poles with nuclear fallout. In short, Russia is a nuclear terrorist state, and it's shocking that it hasn't been eliminated from the Security Council by the UN General Assembly yet. And I really think it's appropriate to start thinking about it. First of all, we know that our Prime Minister, as a collaborator, goes to Moscow and shakes hands and is apparently controlled by Russian services, or if he were controlled, he wouldn't behave differently, I'll say it this way conditionally. But really, it's appropriate here that how to force Russia, in my opinion, the only way is for the international community to totally isolate Russia. I think it's time to start considering breaking diplomatic relations with Russia. Because it's completely pointless to have any relations with them, they'll do what they want anyway.
I would still ask you, within this strategy, do you think it's Putin himself behind it, or is it some military leadership there?
Unequivocally like this, they certainly have military leadership that routinely lives with this, just as they have nonlinear warfare or reflexive control. We call it hybrid warfare, they call it nonlinear warfare. This is something that's already indoctrinated in those armed forces, something that Russian military academics write about, which can commonly be found in those open sources. Of course, it's also part of those classified manuals. Putin is from this environment, he's from the KGB, where in the Soviet Union they had no qualms, they counted on a large thermonuclear war. The Russians have always been like this. And now Putin is at the head of that system, but the system produced him. That means, it's not just Putin, but it's happening with Putin's knowledge, it's happening on his orders, I'm convinced of that. It's not possible, especially in Russia, in such a centralized country, that some officers would just decide like that. Putin is doing it deliberately, he's giving a clear message to Trump that he doesn't care about him, and the entire West. It's in the spirit of what was heard on Russian television, we must frighten them. They're ready to use a bigger caliber, make some fatal mistake, set something off, as if to frighten others. That's why I'm talking about the fact that under these circumstances, we shouldn't be discussing whether FICO will continue to profit from the transfer of gas from Russia to Europe, but discussing that Russia is simply a terrorist state. And with a terrorist state that's ready to murder civilians completely aimlessly, there's no point in negotiating, there you need to stand up, because Russia has already started the war. Russia has de facto already started, at least in those non-kinetic parts of the Third World War, as it's clearly conducting a hostile campaign against us. I don't understand why the President of the Republic or the Prime Minister go to take photos with Brachikov and actually question the entire course of these electoral campaigns. Now they're shouting about something else, but in reality, it's such a situation where we see that Russia doesn't respect absolutely any rules and all hypocrites are trying to repaint it and say that there's no war in Ukraine. If something fell on apartment buildings in Bratislava, if someone shelled Rusinov or Davinska Nova Vase or Petritskaya, they would claim the same to others. You know what happened? A gas explosion, but in reality, there's no war there. Simply, this is a catastrophic attitude of our government to such aggression. This is no longer about politics, about ideology. Simply, it's the gratuitous murder of civilians, unprovoked. Because if someone objects, for example, with the Middle East, it's different there. There, it's a disproportionate use of force by Israel. But here, the Russians themselves provoked the aggression, started it, and when they're not succeeding, they punish the civilian population by wanting to massacre them as much as possible.
Let's move on, please, to the battlefields. What's happening there?
If we look, I'll start by saying that the strategic bombing continues. In addition to this attack on Kyiv, there were others. Ukrainian forces are trying to counterattack. And here we see the difference. Ukrainian forces attack military factories, fuel depots, military bases, or infrastructure, nodes, for example, transport ones, through which massive columns and trains pass for the continuation of that Russian aggression.
Let's discuss the situation in Chasiv Yar. Russians declare that they have occupied Chasiv Yar. Ukrainians deny it. What's the truth?
We don't know exactly yet, because I'm very cautious when Ukrainians claim it's not true. We know that Chasiv Yar was already largely occupied for months, but Ukrainians still held the western part, the western districts of that city. And although there was fighting in Chasiv Yar, they're fighting for every meter. I must say here that we're talking about when Bakhmut fell in May 2023, on May 20th, that was still conquered by the Wagner Group, and later they were frustrated and caused that rebellion a month later, when they made the march on Moscow. It was clear that the Russians' next step would be to conquer Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar was the second line for the Ukrainians. That's supposed to be the fallback position, to which they retreated from Bakhmut when they decided to retreat. The Ukrainians then even at one point were also making counterattacks, as if they started what the Russians are doing now, that they started bypassing Bakhmut from that southern side. It looked like they might take it back, but in the end, they didn't decide to do that. But they established a large defensive line at Chasiv Yar. It's also given by the fact that there's a canal there, the so-called Donetsk-Donbas Canal. And that's a good obstacle that prevents mechanized troops from advancing, so they built defensive positions there. And actually already in the winter of 2023, at the beginning of 2024, there was escalation, and the Russians were trying to cross that canal. That means that direct fighting for Chasiv Yar has been going on for 16 months from April last year until now. And as far as those wider battles are concerned, it can be said that for more than 2 years, the Russians have been trying to conquer Chasiv Yar since the fall of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians knew this could be the next target, so they carried out engineering works, equipped defensive positions, underground bunkers, railway logistic routes there. They built reserve positions of the second line at Konstantinovka, where there's also fighting now. So this is the context that explains why it relates to Chasiv Yar.
And if the Russians really conquered Chasiv Yar, what would that cause?
The significance is important. Chasiv Yar is an important stronghold. Just as Bakhmut was on an elevated place and behind Bakhmut was such a terrain wave, which gave advantageous positions. Even in the 21st century, this is important. You have an overview, you see, the one who has to go up even a slight hill, and also in clear terrain, is at a disadvantage. The Ukrainians knew they had to hold Chasiv Yar, because behind Chasiv Yar and behind Konstantinovka is like a plateau, such a valley. It's something like the Poprad Basin, or just something flat. Of course, Ukraine is flat when we compare it with Slovakia, but it's not a board. In short, there are terrain irregularities. Chasiv Yar was on such favorable terrain that whoever holds it can see the surroundings. This means that even the Russians bypassing around Chasiv Yar, as long as the Ukrainians are still in at least part of Chasiv Yar, is not so simple, because they're under the fire control of those Ukrainian forces. So that's one thing. And it's actually such an entrance gate towards Kramatorsk, Druzhba, and Konstantinovka. If Konstantinovka also fell, the Russians could. They would gain control over that terrain and therefore would also clearly support those forces of theirs that would try to push into that Kramatorsk-Slaviansk area. So to sum it up, the timeline of the battle was such that in April last year, Russia began a direct attack on Chasiv Yar. In the middle of 2024, they occupied the canal, which divides the city, and began occupying those eastern districts. And from February this year, most of the city was already under control. Chasiv Yar is a town of 12 to 13,000. That's a town like Halak and Zaori, or about Shamarin, or something like that. So that's why I'm saying it's not a strategic target, because strategic for me is what would change the course of the war. And that would be, for example, the fall of Kyiv, the fall of Dnipro, the fall of Kharkiv. That would already have a big impact on the course of the war. But Chasiv Yar is an important tactical stronghold, which actually holds like the entrance gate to that area. So the state is such that when we look, the 24th Mechanized Brigade, the Kraken Regiment, the International Legion fought there. The Ukrainians deployed good forces there. The attack intensified when the Russians last year, actually the direct attack started when the Russians conquered Avdiivka and then moved Special Operations Forces and other elite units from there to this section in Chasiv Yar. Why am I explaining this in such detail? I wanted to give the context of how it evolved, that it's actually 16 months of direct fighting for Chasiv Yar. And we still don't have confirmation that the Russians have gotten Chasiv Yar. That's in response to someone saying here how very quickly the Russians are still advancing. No, they're not advancing quickly. They gained 4,000 square kilometers last year, but they were trying because they couldn't conquer Toretsk, Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar. What do we have there? Kupiansk. So actually they're bypassing the cities and pushing into those less populated areas, where the Ukrainian defense is also less solid. Of course, every city and village that the Russians conquer is scorched earth, it's totally bombed out. By the way, this attack on Chasiv Yar began with the dropping of thermobaric bombs, ODOB 1500, these are 1,500 kilogram thermobaric bombs. That's a total devastating effect that occurred there to paralyze those positions. So we're in a situation where it's an important point. It's not cause for panic. In short, the Ukrainians know here that they can't make a counterattack, and they're trying to increase the price for the Russians for every square kilometer, with the understanding that the defense is also more advantageous, they can defend better in that city. It's designed in such a way that they more or less let the sparse areas go, because they don't have enough capacities to hold such a long section of the front. The essential thing is, and with this I'll transition smoothly to the development on the other parts of the front, that the effort to bypass Kupiansk continues. We've been talking about that for a long time. Again, they moved by 1 or 2 villages, where they actually seized 2 such villages on that front. They're moving on the other side of the Oskil River. The Ukrainians have blocked the Russians from advancing on Sumy. So we see that the Russians are actually testing that Ukrainian defense, they're pushing hard at Pokrovsk, at Kupiansk, and now in that Chasiv Yar. In Toretsk, they're still fighting in the city, but we don't see any fundamental changes there. In short, the Russians will try for the rest of this main combat season to break through that defense. And since last year they consumed those reserves. Because the original assumption was that last year there would be such maintenance battles on both sides, and that both sides would try to gather those reserves for some major offensive this year, in 2025, to try to change the course of the war. Because this is the course of the war, as Zaluzny says, today an ambassador, that it could last until 2034. In short, until the total exhaustion, as my colleague Svarovsky says, until the total exhaustion of one side or the other. So this is really the development in Ukraine also in that broader context.
Let's move from Ukraine to the Middle East. What's the situation in the Gaza Strip?
The situation in the Gaza Strip is complicated. Those fights are still continuing. We saw continuing airstrikes and ground strikes in Gaza, especially in Rafah, Khan Younis, and northern Gaza. Yesterday, Israeli forces killed 34 Palestinians, including 15 civilians near Rafah. That civil defense report confirms casualties from gunfire near those aid centers. I deliberately looked at how it's written and pronounced. It's in the northwest of Rafah. Those casualties are simply rising. I'm not going to either confirm or dispute those numbers reported by the Gaza Health Authority, because that's not a completely reliable source either. But the truth is that the humanitarian situation is catastrophic directly in Gaza. International observers are also going there, and the French foreign minister has commented on it. We see that famine is escalating in the Gaza Strip. These prolonged fights in those difficult conditions in a densely populated area without the possibility of escape for that population, because no one wants them, the Egyptians don't want them, Jordan doesn't want them, so they have their consequences. There are reported, for example, 154 deaths from hunger. A third of the residents regularly have problems with adequate nutrition. And this is important information. On July 27, Netanyahu finally agreed that they would make humanitarian pauses in the fighting every day to allow those aid convoys. Netanyahu did this even without the knowledge of his radical ministers Smotrich and the other one, I forgot the name now, with the understanding that he already sees that the international pressure is very great. In short, The French foreign minister was involved. He called it a scandal, what the situation is like in the Gaza Strip, and this also increases the pressure on the Israeli forces.
So there's no ceasefire yet?
Unfortunately not, no ceasefire has been reached. Despite international pressure, no formal ceasefire has been agreed. Hamas rejected all those proposals. Previously, they submitted their own proposal for a 60-day ceasefire, but again those negotiations stalled due to disagreements about buffer zones and access to aid. But there's also pressure from international diplomacy. I've already indicated that Israel is getting into partial isolation. 17 countries, the European Union itself, and the League of Arab States supported such a proposal, which demands, I have to look at my notes, for Hamas to disarm Gaza, for it to be handed over to the Palestinian authorities. That's what also governs the West Bank. And that this should open the way to a sovereign Palestinian state.
And how is it developing, in your opinion? Because there are also strong pressures and promises from the United Kingdom and France. Will these countries keep their word and recognize the Palestinian state?
The United Kingdom, France, and most recently Canada have threatened and announced that they actually intend in September to.
Do they have any conditions there?
Yes, that's exactly what I want to say, that at the UN General Assembly they would then recognize Palestinian statehood. But on the condition of progress in the ceasefire, which means they're also more cautious about it. Even Portugal said it's considering this step. Donald Trump doesn't like it, which means there's a problem now if those conditions aren't met. The conflict didn't start on October 7, 2023, but it's symbolic that this phase of the war started then. Now some say that Israel is also occupying those other territories, which were originally by the UN resolution, when the State of Israel was created, was divided, that Palestinian trusteeship territory, when it was divided between Arabs and Jews. So Israel is also occupying other territories and the Arabs still call it occupied territories. They just forgot to say that when Israel was created, there were about 730,000 Jews in those territories that were assigned to them. And the Arabs, in response to this, expelled even more, 850,000 Jews from their countries. That means, what was Israel supposed to do? Well, that was still in the 40s, in 1947 to 1949. So Israel housed them in temporary refugee camps. That was more than 100% of the population of Israel itself, which the Arabs forcibly expelled from their homes, where they had lived for centuries. So they settled and Israel placed them there. For several decades, these Jews lived in those refugee camps in those territories that were originally assigned to the Arabs. Eventually, Israel decided that, given that there were several of those wars throughout that history. So Israel decided quite simply that, well, we don't have any other living space, so they settled them there permanently. And this is what the Arabs are now arguing, that they want these territories back. Meanwhile, the Arabs have the whole area for themselves, the whole Middle East is Arab, except for small Israel. And now the essence is that if it happens without resolving this conflict, without Hamas disarming, without them giving up that goal of complete liquidation of the Jewish nation, that means the massacre of those Jews and the liquidation of the Jewish state and that theory they preach, that from the Jordan to the sea, so we'll create a Palestinian state. We'll recognize the state and at the moment of that recognition, we already have a war conflict between two member states in the United Nations and at the same time we have a blocked Security Council, which can't resolve this conflict. That means, there's such tension. On the other hand, it's clear, and I've long been an advocate of that two-state solution, that simply there's no other way there. But that other state must also act like a state. It can't pretend that it's actually a state only when it needs it, but it's not actually a state and says, Hamas did that other terrorist, that other jihadist, they did it. Not us. Simply, a solution must be found that will guarantee a dignified life and security for both Palestinians and Jews and everyone else who's part of the population of the Jewish state of Israel.
Do you think it's possible that Hamas will adapt like this, that it will give up its ideological goals?
I don't want to speculate, it's difficult. Because Hamas over the years it has ruled, at least in Gaza, but of course also in those other parts, has sown such hatred and such inclination to hatred towards Jews that there's this concern. And that's what the Israelis are warning about. They say, well, You'll create that state, that nothing will change about it, it will continue further in that aggressiveness. And after us Jews, they want us to accept it all and pretend that nothing is happening. That means, guarantees need to be found here. I could imagine it such that an intermediate step to that would be, either through Arab countries or someone third, but that there would be some international protectorate in those Palestinian territories, which would actually ensure reconstruction, development of those areas, and gradual strengthening of that domestic authority of those Palestinians to the extent that it would be able to keep even these terrorists under control. Because otherwise, what kind of state is it that doesn't control its own territories, doesn't control what happens from that territory towards those neighbors?
How are we, please, in the rest of Israel doing, and in Syria?
Well, of course, the tension is also in the rest of Israel. There we know that on the northern borders, in the Golan Heights, in connection with those Druze, the tension is higher there. We've seen higher military activity there as well. Israeli Druze, some of them crossed into Syria to support their relatives in Suwaida. And on the other hand, some were radical, so the Israeli Defense Forces arrested dozens of these Druze also because they broke through the border fence, with the understanding that they treated it as a security risk. Because that fence, when it's opened, it's possible to pass through the barrier from both sides, from Israel out and also from outside into Israel. And Israel also carried out humanitarian aid. Just yesterday, they gave about $500,000 in food and medical aid to those Druze communities in Suwaida. It was coordinated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And if we look at that further development, there's a ceasefire there. Those sectarian clashes have quieted down for a while. Israel supports these Druze. Al-Shara, the interim president, was again quite careless, because he expressed himself as if unilaterally towards those Bedouins. That's not good if he wants to maintain the compactness of that country. It's not good to even indirectly support some of those sects or those groups within these interethnic and inter-sectarian struggles. There, one needs to be balanced and impartially above the matter. But there's been a ceasefire between Israel and Syria since July 19, which was mediated by the United States and supported by Turkey and Jordan. It's more or less being observed. Last Saturday, on July 26 in Paris, negotiations took place between Israeli and Syrian representatives, which were mediated by the United States to prevent further escalation. There it's more or less fragile stability, to call it that.
Part 2, Behind the Scenes.
Strategic backstage. What do you have prepared today, sir, in the backstage?
I have 3 things there that I would definitely like to at least touch upon. First, the sale of weapons to Ukraine, financed by allies, but also that controversial law, because it was revoked again and the state returned to its original state. And I would also like to look at one of the betrayals in Ukrainian ranks, because it's quite a serious matter, which has also penetrated some media. So let's get to it. So in the United States, Republican Senators Roger Wicker and Jim Risch introduced the so-called peace law. It's a bill that would establish a fund of the Treasury Department for NATO allies to finance American weapons deliveries to Ukraine. Now, not all weapons would go through this fund. But about this fund, it's said that the goal is to allocate $8 billion annually as such a clearing, or such a buffer, cushion, which would be in the American budget, from which the payments of those deliveries for allies would be prepaid or pre-financed. And allies would then pay into this fund, as if returning that money. The point is that some Western countries, NATO member countries, would also give weapons to Ukraine from their stocks. The moment they decided to pass these weapons to Ukraine, the Treasury Department would quickly pre-finance the production of replacements for those weapons. And subsequently, these countries would return that money to the fund, when they would take those weapons as payment. I'll give an example. The Germans hand over 2 Patriot batteries to Ukraine. And actually, the Americans start producing new Patriot batteries for them. They pre-finance it from this budget, because the Germans will pay for it when they're produced and they receive them. And the Germans would subsequently pay back. This is a mechanism that's meant to ensure that it will be smooth, that it won't be subject to those arguments, struggles over specific budget items, as we've seen even under Biden, that aid package that got stuck, that actually it will be such a regular cycle. There are those probable contributors. Most are Germany, the United Kingdom, but there's also talk about Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. And they would actually use this mechanism. That's what was talked about, what the President of the United States announced on July 14, when he also had that conversation with Zelensky and said that allies would buy this. There are of course also those who aren't entirely willing, like France, Italy. They want to help Ukraine, but even if they were buying from the United States, they want it directly. That we'll buy it and pass it on, or pass on our own, which we can produce. And the White House, this is a law that's an initiative from Congress, from the Senate. The White House is receptive to this and expects that this law will be approved by the end of the year. And they don't have objections to it, which is quite a positive change in the attitude of that Trump administration, especially after that initial, very anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian.
Let's go to that controversial Ukrainian law. Please.
The absolutely key news is that I revoke what I ordered and I order what I revoked, like in that fairy tale. President Zelensky ensured that he convinced those political players in the parliament in the Verkhovna Rada, they have a unicameral parliament, who yesterday evening approved his bill, by which he actually re-established the independence of that NABU, and that other unit, SAPO, that is, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, and that Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office SAPO. That means, they're returning to where they were. They will be independent, they won't be in that subordination of the Prosecutor General. Here it was shown that civil society achieved its goal, that external criticism also had an effect. Of course, some moral and political damage will already be permanent. I'm not going to analyze that internal political situation in depth now, but I'll try to look at another aspect. I read an interesting article about it. This, of course, also serves Russian propaganda, but these offices say that in the years 2016 to 2025, 71 legislators were accused. That was in that period before the Russian invasion. During the recent period during that invasion, 42 legislators were accused, of which 31 are from the current parliament of Ukraine. And these were embezzlement of property, accepting unauthorized benefits, abuse of power, or what is completely common with us, false property declarations, illegal enrichment. They actually emphasize that no one is above the law. That means, if there was also some pro-Russian element, what I said last time applies. That this can be cleaned up even where it is, and the fact that you subordinate it somewhere doesn't change anything and doesn't clean the institution of Russian collaborators. But here it needs to be said that law, when they subordinated it, that's the fight between legal integrity and political maneuvering. Zelensky somehow accepted it, signed that law, which the Verkhovna Rada approved. Now he pushed them to return back. To conclude, that fight against corruption really works. That's why these things were happening around that law. And it turns out that not only is that institutional independence of these bodies important, but that the public is also important. And that Ukraine, unlike Russia, and unfortunately today also Slovakia, is still, despite being at war, a functioning democracy. Because we have a government coalition that, despite public protests, does what it wants. And it's getting worse and worse.
We have our own experiences with Russian agents, and we have more of them here. But you mentioned one in Ukraine. In Ukrainian ranks, what was that?
A screw-up happened. A major of the Ukrainian Air Force, a flight instructor, was arrested for allegedly leaking classified information about operations of F-16 and Mirage 2000 aircraft. He worked at that base and was supposed to hand over this information to Russian forces. It said about him that he handed over coordinates and positions of aircraft, where those aircraft are located. He shared with the Russians also those orders for deployment and even those tactics of strikes, which is extremely important, because it allowed the Russians firstly to try to destroy these aircraft and secondly to prepare for possible attacks. And the history is that he had an ex-wife. She was a former soldier. She remained in Melitopol. Today she collaborates with the Russians and she was supposed to recruit him, that former wife, and he allowed himself to be enticed. So now he has a charge of treason. I think that in such a case, even the death penalty would probably be appropriate, but of course, it needs to be really investigated, proven. We're in states governed by the rule of law, that means, it needs to be proven. But I think there will probably be quite a lot of evidence there. And it's unpleasant, because it of course reduces the effectiveness of those Ukrainian forces and also increases distrust towards them. So the consequences are that there's an operational risk for the Ukrainians. Of course there are questions of trust from Western allies. It of course also has an impact on that internal political movement. The Russians have collaborators and traitors there. Simply, it's clear that those Russians were so confident when they thought they would make that 3-day war. They believed that they had enough of these collaborators there and that they would actually just make a quiet palace coup, install Yanukovych too there, and will simply continue to control Ukraine, and the West will watch. And Russian troops will march along our borders at Uzhhorod and will practice as they practiced in the autumn of 2021 at the Ukrainian borders. There will probably be more betrayals there.
Let's move to us, however. The President and Prime Minister and government coalition are sharply attacking our key ally. I'm referring, of course, to the United Kingdom. How do you assess this?
I assess it as a very unfortunate step in such political desperation. Because first of all, from what they claim, nothing like that happened. It's not completely standard for a foreign country to run a campaign to support voter turnout. But these are just deductions of SMER, which weren't even in that article, in the British one, that by young people going to vote, it was supposed to advantage progressive Slovakia and harm SMER. So first of all, with this SMER is saying that it's against young people, that mass exodus of those young people is a deliberate policy on the part of SMER. SMER is driving young people out of Slovakia. But what's more serious is that this was first put into the media. This is done in such a way that in such a case, as they can have fear in SMER, it could have frightened them, they can have doubts, they can have their paranoid deductions. But first and foremost, it's done quietly. Even when an ambassador is summoned, he's first summoned for an explanation and only then does one go out to a press conference. But SMER, Robert Fico personally, and then also all these coalition politicians, including Matas Sutaj, who cheated and grossly violated the law in the presidential elections, are abusing this and attacking the United Kingdom. The Halas party again grossly violated the law in the presidential elections. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but one thing I know is that those presidential elections were neither fair, nor honest, nor lawful. Whether the president was lawfully elected, let constitutional lawyers comment on that. But there was massive violation of the law in the presidential election. They're attacking Britain for interfering in our elections. And on the other hand, SMER's election campaign was conducted under the direction of the Russian embassy. The election campaign of the president, now Peter Pellegrini, began with a photo with Brachikov, the Russian ambassador, was conducted non-transparently. The law was massively violated during it. And some Putin's money launderer, who lived somewhere in Bardayev, was also hovering around the campaign. And I'm amazed that even our media, and especially that investigative part, that they don't beat into this, because it's a far bigger screw-up than what the British did. And Fico is almost going to declare war on the West from this. He's doing it deliberately, because all of this bears the marks of a Russian intelligence game. I'll speculate a bit here. It's possible that this is one of those, even if this article came out in Britain independently, but that this approach of Fico is exactly moderated by Russian intelligence services through the Russian embassy and is one of the consequences of Fico's visits, secret visits to Moscow.
After the break. Today we're continuing in the series about World War II. Last time we finished the Battle of France. Today we're getting ready for the Battle of Britain. Let's start. When did this battle take place, and what were its main events?
So we ended last time with the Battle of France ending after 6 weeks on June 25, 1940, when France fell. The northern part of France was occupied by the Germans, the southern part was a puppet French pro-Nazi government in Vichy. And the troops of the British Expeditionary Force and some others managed to escape to Britain. Hitler decided that now, when we recap what happened in that year, when he got Denmark, Norway, got Benelux and France, he actually controlled all of Western Europe, only the British across the Channel, or across the English Channel, spoiled it for him. And therefore he decided that he would also deal with Britain. Because Hitler, of course, also expanded into Africa and other parts of the world. For the British not to spoil it for him, he decided to take a decisive step. Operation Sea Lion came and the Battle of Britain began, because if you want to go to England, you must first eliminate the Air Force, so that you can sail across, land and conquer England, or blackmail it. So that battle took place from July 10 to October 31, 1940. It was mainly a fight between the Luftwaffe of Nazi Germany and the British Royal Air Force. The goal was to gain air superiority, so that the Germans could pave the way for that invasion, as I've already mentioned. There were such key milestones. Churchill warned the Parliament on June 18 that the Battle of Britain could start soon. July 10 was the official start. The Luftwaffe began attacking British convoys in the English Channel. Then on August 13 was the so-called Adler Tag, Eagle Day. A major attack on British Royal Air Force airfields began. August 15 was the biggest day. The Luftwaffe deployed 2,000 combat flights. A huge force for that time, but it suffered heavy losses. A few days later was the so-called hardest day, when there were intense battles with large losses on both sides. In September, the so-called Blitz Air War began, when the Luftwaffe saw that it couldn't defeat the British overall, they were destroying airfields and weakening British capacity, they began attacking London directly. September 15 is that Battle of Britain Day, when the Royal Air Force shot down 56 German aircraft in one day. On September 17, Hitler postponed that mentioned Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. That was the effort to invade Britain. At the end, on October 31 was the end of the battle. The Luftwaffe abandoned those raids on Britain in daylight.
There were some key critical factors there. What were they for the outcome of this war?
Several things. Radar technology. For the first time, radars were massively deployed. The British had that chain-home radar system, which could warn in time of those air raids. Then they had the so-called Dowding system. It was such an integrated air defense network, which allowed fighters to be activated in time, deployed, raised into the air. Radars found out that a German attack was starting. Where it was heading, where those aircraft were going, according to that the British coordinated. These weren't such random takeoffs, but an integrated system was made. Today we would call it an integrated air defense system. There was also an interesting fact that Britain also used pilots from other countries. That's where the famous history of Czechoslovak squadrons in the Royal Air Force began. They called it the FEW. Volunteers from Poland, Canada, New Zealand, and Czechoslovakia started. Mainly from these countries. There were also from other countries. Such key findings from it, which can be deduced, were that air superiority is decisive. Simply, control over the sky can decide the outcome of the war. Technology and coordination, that means that radar and centralized command, gave Britain a strategic advantage. Morale, adaptability, but also propaganda power. Then Churchill used his famous phrase that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. With that he immortalized that role of the Royal Air Force, or actually that victory of the Royal Air Force. The fact that they endured it, that eventually that German attack ended, had a completely fundamental influence on the course of the war. Actually, that Sea Lion or Sea Lion never came. And on the contrary, the British then began to systematically attack German troops on the continent.
In the Battle of France, we also mentioned some key persons from this battle. Do you have such persons also in this Battle of Britain?
Definitely. When I take it, so on the British side it was mainly that, we've already mentioned him, Dowding, the Air Chief Marshal, who was actually the architect of that air defense and led that command from Bentley Priory. There was also Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who commanded the 11th Group defending London and the entire southeast of England. Another well-known person is Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory. He advocated the controversial big wing tactic. That was such an air tactic, which they adapted at that time. Of course, Winston Churchill. He managed to unite the nation, motivate it, rally it into a hard fight. And on the other side Kesselring, commander of the Luftwaffe. He led those attacks on southeast England. But there were also, for example, such persons as Josef František, a Czech pilot, who was at that moment, in this battle, the highest scoring of the Royal Air Forces, or Douglas Bader, a member of the Royal Forces, who flew despite the loss of both legs. That was a symbol of courage. That's when those legends were born. Of course, this battle damaged Hermann Göring and many German leaders, because for the first time Hitler was frustrated, because until then everything had worked out for them and suddenly they got stuck.
But you mentioned that Churchill and his quote. We know that the war was mostly fought in the air. From what you said, what did we take for the future? How did warfare develop for the future? From the French battle, we took maneuver warfare and tank pincers and coordination of air-ground combat.
If we're talking about the Battle of Britain, then that contribution to the development of warfare was in several areas. First, in the tactical and technological area, where there was progress, integration of radars. The doctrine of strategic bombing. It was controversial, because subsequently it ended in the complete bombing of Dresden. The British Royal Forces, but also the United States Air Force adopted long-distance bombing to paralyze enemy industry. Of course, it eventually ended with carpet bombing of everything that was also around that industry. The introduction of heavy bombers. Whether the Avro Lancaster, or the B-17 Flying Fortress. They could fly further. They had a longer range and could survive even intense pressure from the opponent. Combined air combat was made. Bombers, accompanied by those fighter squadrons, long distance, deep strikes into enemy territory. And later the Germans already in 1944 introduced the first jet propulsion. That was later than the Battle of Britain, but that's in that technological area. If we're talking about tactical, actually the ways of using the Air Force changed. Because for example Typhoon or Thunderbolt aircraft supported ground units, attack tanks, supply lines. That was then proven in that later combat. The Russians also started using it, and the Germans. Even later, when I looked just at such an overview of those trends, during the Cold War actually the Air Force still began to be used as a tool of strategic deterrence. Then there was a transition to those supersonic speeds, strategic bombers came. Actually, all of this has roots somewhere and it started precisely from those findings from the Battle of Britain.
Part 3, 360-degree scan.
360 degrees. We won't delay and I'll directly ask you about the conflict in Thailand and Cambodia. Will the ceasefire be accepted permanent?
Well, that's a fundamental question, because it was shown here, already when that conflict broke out, I said it last time, that it was shown here that with frozen conflicts nothing is permanent. A frozen conflict is just a frozen conflict, it can flare up at any time. That's why also that demand in Ukraine, that there must be a lasting peace with security guarantees. Otherwise, there's a risk of recidivism, that the conflict will return again. I'll just quickly say, that conflict between Cambodia and Thailand flared up on July 24, it quickly escalated. At least 38 people died there, people had to be evacuated from those areas, fighter jets, tanks were used there. It was fortunately, unlike India and Pakistan, kept in that border area around that monastery or that temple and in those adjacent areas, but even so it was very intense. Well, that ceasefire agreement, as I predicted last time, so it also happened, that eventually a ceasefire was signed on July 28, effective from midnight local time. And it was as immediate and safe. The mediator was Malaysia, under the leadership of its Prime Minister and actually on the platform of ASEAN, because he's currently also the executive chairman of ASEAN, that's that Association of Southeast Asian Countries. And the United States and China were such the other players, who supported this effort. There they tried to balance also their influences in that area. So it succeeded. Those conditions are that no reinforcements of units, that borders are closed, that there's a ban on shooting at civilians, using artillery, because that's indirect fire, you don't have control over that target area. Establishment of a General Border Committee, which is actually to delimit the territory. It's supposed to meet for the first time on August 4, and is actually to demarcate that border. And restoration of direct communication channels between those military and political leaders. The conditions also address that observer mission, which is actually to oversee the ceasefire. But you asked about the sustainability. So well, at the beginning there were incidents. That's always the case, that when some ceasefire is declared, it takes some time for it to penetrate, and for it to be adopted also by those commanders, who are used to rapid fire, to return it quickly. So there were some incidents, some skirmishes, but they managed to suppress them. I would call it stable but fragile. That means stable, but very fragile, because of course that conflict as such wasn't resolved. There was only a ceasefire, so the conflict froze again, and that nationalist tension and also economic pressure are still there. That means that rebuilding that ceasefire into a long-term settlement will take some time. Let's be glad that it calmed down. The risk that it will break out again will be here until this is still a frozen conflict. That means, until both sides leave that conflict with the understanding that they found a solution, with which they may not be happy, but they can live with it in the long term. So we wish them to find it.
Final quote.
Sir, in the last episode, but also in this one, we mentioned Sir Winston Churchill.
Yes, because I think that for this week, given what's happening outside, but also what's happening at home, this is important. Everyone is in favor of free speech. Hardly a day passes without its being extolled, but some people's idea of it is that they are free to say what they like, but if anyone else says anything back, that is an outrage. Sir Winston Churchill, British War Prime Minister.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.